The accident happened at 14 minutes past 3 on a Tuesday afternoon in October, on the straight stretch of Route 9 between the Millbrook Overpass and the Cedar Street Junction, a section of road Hank Dillon had ridden so many times across so many years that his body knew its every feature the way a pianist's hands know a piece they have played 1,000 times, automatically, below the level of conscious thought. The truck that came across the centerline was driven by a man who had fallen asleep, 3 seconds of unconsciousness that neither man would have been able to predict or prevent. And the impact when it came was the specific kind of impact that compresses time rather than extending it. Not a long, terrible sequence of events, but a single, violent fact that existed and then was over, leaving behind a silence that felt disproportionately large given how brief the sound had been. Hank was conscious when the paramedics arrived. He was sitting on the shoulder of Route 9 with his back against the guardrail and his right arm held against his chest in the instinctive, protective posture of someone whose body has already understood, before the mind has caught up, that something in that region is broken. He was not looking at the paramedics. He was looking at the motorcycle. It had come to rest 40 feet away on the opposite shoulder, and from where Hank sat, he could see enough of it to understand, with the specific clarity that sometimes arrives in the immediate aftermath of shock, that what he was looking at was not something that could be ridden away from the scene. The frame had contacted the truck's front axle. The left side of the engine had taken the primary impact. The front end had been driven backward into the engine casing in a way that no amount of optimism was going to simplify into something fixable on the side of the road. He told the paramedic who crouched beside him that he needed a minute. The paramedic, a woman about 30 with the specific calm of someone who had learned that arguing with injured people on roadsides was less efficient than simply waiting them out, told him he could have one. Hank spent that minute looking at the motorcycle, not inventorying the damage the way a practical man might, but simply looking at it the way you look at something that has just changed from one thing into something else, and you have not yet decided what the second thing is. The flatbed arrived before Sandra did. Hank watched the driver chain the motorcycle down without looking away. The specific, deliberate attention of someone who understands that the act of watching something matter is part of what makes it matter. Sandra arrived 11 minutes later, having driven from the school where she worked in a state she would later describe to her friend at church as the longest 12 minutes of her life. And she came to where Hank was sitting with the paramedics and looked at his face first, and then at the sling they had fashioned from what was available, and then, briefly, at the flatbed pulling out onto Route 9 with the motorcycle secured in the back. And she took his good hand and held it without saying anything, because she had been married to this man for 29 years and understood, in the complete way you understand someone after that long, that what he needed from her in that exact moment was not words. The broken collarbone was confirmed at the hospital, along with the 3 cracked ribs, injuries that the attending doctor described as serious but not complex, the kind that healed with time and limitation and the specific patient discipline of someone willing to do less than they wanted for the weeks required. Hank listened to the doctor's instructions with the attentive courtesy he brought to all professional conversations, and privately assigned them approximately the weight they deserved, which was somewhat less than the doctor intended. Sandra sat beside him and knew exactly what he was thinking and chose not to say so until they were in the car, at which point she said it clearly, and Hank told her she was right. And they drove home in the companionable silence of 2 people who have had enough versions of this particular conversation to know where it ends. The motorcycle was in the garage when they arrived. The flatbed driver had backed in carefully, Sandra having called ahead to arrange it, and the machine sat in the center of the space under the fluorescent light, looking smaller than Hank had expected, diminished by the damage in a way that went beyond the physical, the way certain objects lose something invisible alongside what they lose visibly. Hank stood in the garage doorway for a long time before he went in. Sandra stood behind him and let him look. The damage was worse seen directly than it had appeared from the shoulder of Route 9. The frame rails on the left side were bent. Not broken clean, but bent, which in some ways was harder to look at because bent implied a violence of process rather than a simple catastrophic failure. The metal having been pushed past everything it was designed to withstand and then past that. The engine casing was cracked from the primary impact point diagonally across the lower section, a crack that crossed through the specific area of the casing where Ray Dillon had cast his own modifications into the original design, a section that existed nowhere else in the world on any other motorcycle because Ray had made it himself in the backyard workshop in 1984, with tools he had acquired across 20 years of careful and selective spending, and the knowledge of exactly how he had made it had died with him 6 years ago. 3 fabricated components on the left side of the motorcycle, components that Ray had made entirely by hand from his own designs using techniques he had developed through years of experiment and refinement, were destroyed beyond recognition. They were not components that could be ordered from a catalog, or sourced from a specialist supplier, or reverse engineered from a manufacturer's documentation, because they had never been manufactured, only made, by one man once who was gone. Hank stood over the wreck with his good hand resting on the tank in the one area that had been largely spared, the right side, and pressed the 2 fingers of that hand to his own collarbone without noticing he was doing it, and looked at the motorcycle his father had spent 4 years building from nothing with his own hands, and understood what the damage actually meant in a way that was entirely separate from anything the insurance company or the doctors or the chapter members who would arrive over the following days would be able to fully reach. Sandra found the photographs that evening. She had always known where they were, in the flat archival box on the high shelf at the back of the bedroom closet, the box she had put there when they moved into this house 17 years ago and had not opened since because there had been no need to open it, the motorcycle being present and real and available to be looked at rather than remembered through paper. She brought the box down from the shelf and set it on the kitchen table and opened the lid and looked at the top photograph, the one she had always thought of as the most important of all of them. Ray Dillon, standing beside the finished motorcycle on the day it first ran, his hand resting on the tank exactly where Hank's hand had rested in the garage an hour earlier, his face carrying an expression she had only ever seen in this photograph, and that Hank had once described to her, in the specific way he described things that mattered most to him, as the only time he ever saw his father look completely satisfied. She carried the box to the garage and set it on the workbench beside the wreck, and Hank looked at it but did not open it that night. And Sandra went inside and left the garage light on because she understood, without being told, that he was not ready to come in yet. Ray Dillon had started building the motorcycle in the spring of 1981 in the backyard workshop behind the house on Ferris Street where Hank grew up, using a rolling frame he had acquired from a salvage yard in the next county, and an engine block that he had rebuilt twice before he was satisfied enough with it to consider it a foundation rather than a liability. Hank was 11 years old that spring, and the workshop had been, for as long as he could remember, the place where his father went to think. A small concrete block structure with a corrugated metal roof that got loud in the rain, and a single fluorescent tube that buzzed slightly in cold weather, and a smell compounded from oil and metal and the specific dry warmth of a space that had been heated and inhabited over many years. Ray was not a man who explained himself while he worked. This was something Hank had understood early and had never resented, understanding instinctively that his father's silence at the workbench was not exclusion, but concentration, and that the correct response to it was to sit quietly on the wooden stool in the corner and watch, which Hank did for more hours across more years than he could accurately calculate, absorbing the specific grammar of his father's hands against metal, the way Ray approached a problem by circling it for a long time before touching it, the way he would set a component down and look at it from a different angle before deciding anything, the way he communicated with his tools through a series of small adjustments and reconsiderations that bore no resemblance to the directed, decisive movements that Hank had seen in other men who worked with their hands, but lacked Ray's particular quality of patience. The motorcycle took 4 years to build because Ray was not building to a deadline or to an external standard, but to his own understanding of what the finished thing should be. An understanding that developed and changed across those 4 years in ways that occasionally required him to undo work he had already done and do it differently. Hank watched him disassemble a component he had spent a month making and set it aside without visible frustration because the component was correct by any reasonable external measure, but was not right by Ray's internal one. And Hank had asked him once, around age 13 or 14, what the difference was between correct and right. And Ray had thought about the question for a long moment before telling him that correct meant something worked the way it was supposed to work, and right meant it worked the way it should have been supposed to work, and that these were not always the same thing, and that learning to tell the difference was the work of a lifetime. The 3 custom-fabricated components that had been destroyed in the accident were the clearest physical expression of everything Ray had meant by that distinction. They were not replacements for standard parts. They were solutions to problems Ray had identified in the original design, problems that nobody else who had ever ridden this configuration of engine and frame had apparently bothered to identify or care about. Problems that Ray had spent months thinking about, before spending further months making the components that addressed them. Components that were invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at, but that Hank had understood, from the years of watching their creation, as the most important things on the motorcycle. Danny Reeves arrived at Hank's garage on the Thursday after the accident, 2 days after Hank came home from the hospital, and spent an hour with the wreck, moving around it with the methodical attention of a man who had been building custom motorcycles for 25 years and knew how to read damage. He crouched beside the bent frame rails. He looked at the cracked engine casing for a long time. He picked up one of the destroyed components, or what remained of it, and turned it over in his hands and looked at the fractured metal and set it back down on the workbench where Sandra had placed the pieces she had collected from the scene. Then he stood up and looked at Hank, who was standing against the far wall with his arm in its sling, and Danny told him what he thought, directly and without softening it, because Hank was not a man who needed things softened. The frame could be straightened, he said. Not perfectly, but close enough that the repair would be structurally sound and largely invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it. The engine casing crack could be addressed, welded, and reinforced in a way that would hold reliably if done correctly. But the 3 fabricated components were a different order of problem entirely. Danny had looked at them carefully, had recognized what they were and what they did, and he told Hank that replicating them was not something he believed was possible for anyone currently alive who had access to what was actually needed, which was not just fabrication skill, but the specific understanding of why those components were designed the way they were, an understanding that had lived entirely in Ray Dillon's mind, and had not, as far as Danny knew, been written down or communicated to anyone before Ray died. He told Hank this, looking him in the eye and holding steady, because he knew that what he was saying was not simply an assessment of metal and geometry, but a sentence being handed down on something Hank had been carrying for 6 years, and that the least he could do was say it clearly, rather than with the hedging and qualification that would have made it easier to say, but harder to actually hear. Hank listened to all of it without his expression changing, and thanked Danny for coming, and Danny told him he was sorry and meant it, and left. 2 other builders came across the following week, one recommended by the chapter, and one whose name Sandra had found through her own research, and both of them arrived at the same conclusion through slightly different reasoning. One of them suggested a partial reconstruction using components from a comparable build that would require significant modification to work, an approach that Hank listened to carefully and then declined without explanation, because the explanation would have required saying out loud that a motorcycle built from other people's parts, however skillfully modified, was not the same motorcycle, and he did not want to have to say that. By the end of the second week, the chapter had accepted, collectively and quietly, the verdict that the professional builders had delivered, and several members had begun to speak to Hank about what he wanted to do next, whether to keep the wreck or have it properly stored, or whether there was some partial restoration worth attempting. Conversations that Hank received with the same patient courtesy he had given to the doctors and the builders, and that he processed with the specific interior quiet of a man who has not yet decided what the loss actually means, and is not going to decide before he is ready. Sandra had put the photograph box on the workbench, and it had stayed there, and on several evenings Hank had gone out to the garage and sat on the wooden stool he had brought in from the storage room. The stool that was the same dimensions and roughly the same vintage as the one he had sat on in his father's workshop as a child. And he had looked at the wreck, and occasionally opened the photograph box and looked at the photographs, and closed it again. He was not looking for anything specific. He was sitting with something, the way you sit with something when you do not yet know what you need from the sitting, but understand that the sitting itself is necessary. Sandra watched this from the kitchen window on 2 of those evenings, and on the 3rd evening, she went out and sat with him for a while without saying anything. And eventually she told him that her friend from church, a woman named Diane Webb, had mentioned her son, a boy who worked with metal in the backyard, who made things from scratch, who had apparently been doing it since he was a child and had become, in Diane's telling of it, quite good, in a way that Diane acknowledged she did not fully understand, but believed in. And Sandra told Hank she thought it might be worth a conversation, and Hank told her to set it up if she wanted to, his voice carrying neither hope nor the particular heaviness of someone who had already given up on hope, simply the openness of a man who had decided that the honest position was to let things arrive and evaluate them when they did. Marcus Webb had built his first tool at age 13 from a length of salvaged steel pipe, a bolt, and a piece of hardwood he had shaped with a file over 3 evenings. A simple drift punch that he needed for a job and could not afford to buy, and so had made instead. And the making of it had taught him something that no amount of reading about tools had quite managed to communicate, which was that a tool was not a finished thing you acquired, but a solution you arrived at, and that arriving at it yourself left you with a different relationship to it than buying it ever could. The workshop behind the house on Cedar Street had started as a 10 by 12-foot section of the backyard that Marcus had cleared himself at 13, laying salvaged concrete blocks as a floor and constructing 3 walls from reclaimed lumber he had collected from 2 demolished buildings in the neighborhood over the course of several months, asking the demolition crews politely and specifically and successfully, because he had learned early that people responded well to someone who knew exactly what they wanted and asked for it directly without embarrassment. The 4th wall was the existing fence, reinforced with additional framing he had added himself. The roof was corrugated metal, purchased with saved money from odd jobs at a cost that had required him to wait 4 months before he had enough, and installed over a single weekend with help from his mother, who had never done anything like it before, and who had been, in Marcus's later telling of the story, more useful than either of them had expected. The tools had accumulated across 5 years through a combination of saved money, careful searching at estate sales and salvage yards, and the specific patience of someone who understood that acquiring the right tool slowly was better than acquiring the wrong tool quickly. He had a small metal lathe he had bought in pieces from 3 different sources and assembled himself using a repair manual he found in the library and his own reasoning where the manual was unclear. He had a welder he had bought used and rebuilt. He had a grinder, a drill press, a selection of hand tools that he maintained with the same care he gave to the work itself, because a tool in poor condition told you nothing reliable about what you were doing, and a tool in good condition was a kind of conversation between the person who made it and the person using it. His mother Diane understood what Marcus was doing, the way she understood most things about her son. Not technically, but accurately, in the way of a parent who has watched a child pursue something with genuine sustained commitment across years, and who has decided that the most useful thing she can do is make space for it, rather than direct it. She worked as an administrative assistant at a dental practice on 4th Street, and she was home by 5:30 most evenings, and on the weekends, she sometimes brought her coffee out to the backyard and sat in the folding chair near the workshop door and read, which Marcus understood as her version of sitting on the wooden stool his father had described, present and quiet, and not requiring anything from the work beyond the right to be near it. The jobs the neighborhood brought him were small and irregular and paid modestly. A bracket that needed remaking after the original snapped, a custom hinge for a gate that no hardware store carried in the right dimensions, a shaft for an old piece of farm equipment that a man 3 streets over had inherited and could not source a replacement part for anywhere reasonable. Marcus did these jobs with the same complete attention he gave to his own projects, not because the pay required it, but because incomplete attention produced incomplete work, and incomplete work was something he experienced as a kind of personal failure that had nothing to do with what anyone else thought about it. He heard about Hank Dillon's motorcycle on a Saturday morning in the 3rd week of October, sitting at the kitchen table while his mother told him what Sandra Dillon had told her at church the previous Sunday: the accident and the damage and the professional builder's assessment, and the 3 fabricated components that could not be replicated. Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting, asking 2 questions when she finished, both of them practical: whether there were photographs of the original motorcycle, and whether the destroyed components were still physically present or had been discarded. His mother told him she believed yes to both, and he told her he would like to see the motorcycle and the photographs if Sandra and her husband were willing, and his mother said she would ask. He arrived at Hank's garage on a Saturday morning in late October, carrying nothing, wearing a gray jacket with a burn mark on the left cuff that he had not bothered to replace because it was still structurally sound. And he introduced himself to Hank at the front door with the directness and the absence of social performance that characterized all of his interactions with adults who did not yet know what to make of him. Hank looked at him for a moment with the specific assessing attention of a man who had spent years reading people accurately and quickly, and led him to the garage without additional conversation because additional conversation was not what either of them needed. Marcus spent the first 40 minutes with the wreck, not the photographs, examining the damage with a systematic attention that moved from the bent frame rails to the cracked engine casing to the area where the 3 destroyed components had been, crouching and crouching again, occasionally pressing 2 fingers to a surface and holding them there the way someone presses their fingertips to a pulse point, and saying nothing throughout. Hank sat on the wooden stool and watched him and said nothing either, which Marcus would later think of as the first sign that this was a man he could work with. When Marcus moved to the photographs, he spent another hour with them, going through the entire box systematically from the first photograph to the last, and then going back through a second time, slower, stopping longer at certain images, holding some of them at different angles in the garage light. He had a small notebook with him that he had not produced during the examination of the wreck, and that he began writing in during the second pass through the photographs. Not notes exactly, more like the beginning of a geometry, dimensions and angles inferred from context rather than directly measured. A provisional understanding that acknowledged its own uncertainty and marked those uncertainties specifically so they could be addressed. When he finished, he set the photographs down and looked at Hank and told him plainly that he believed he could rebuild all 3 destroyed components from scratch. He told him that the photographs gave him enough to understand the external form of each component, and that the external form, combined with understanding the mechanical function that each component performed, would let him reason toward the internal geometry, even where the photographs did not show it directly. He told him he had never made anything this complex before, and that he would make mistakes and start again more than once, and that the whole process would take somewhere between 2 and 4 months, depending on how difficult the reasoning turned out to be in practice, versus how difficult it appeared from where he was standing now. He told him he would charge only the cost of materials. Hank looked at him for a long moment, pressing 2 fingers to his collarbone without noticing he was doing it. And Marcus watched this gesture with the quiet observational attention he brought to everything, and said nothing about it. Hank asked him one question: why he would spend 2 to 4 months on work this difficult for only the cost of materials. And Marcus thought about the question honestly before answering, which Hank recognized as a good sign, and told him that the job was the kind of problem he had been building toward his entire working life without knowing it, and that some things were worth doing for what they taught you rather than for what they paid you, and that he believed this was one of those things. Hank looked at him for another moment and then told him to come back Saturday and they would start with the photographs and see where the understanding went from there. And Marcus thanked him and left. And Hank sat in the garage alone after he heard the front gate close and looked at the wreck and then at the photograph box, and felt, for the first time since the flatbed had pulled away from Route 9 2 weeks earlier, something that was not quite hope, but was at least the space where hope had not yet been foreclosed. Marcus came back on Saturday with his notebook and a camera he had borrowed from his mother, a small digital one that she used for nothing in particular and that he needed for something specific: the ability to photograph the photographs, to create a working archive that he could bring back to his workshop and study under controlled light without having to transport the originals. He explained this to Hank at the garage door, and Hank stepped back and told him to do whatever he needed, a phrase Marcus was learning to understand as the particular way this man gave permission, comprehensively and without qualification, which was different from the hedged and conditional permission of people who were uncertain about what they were agreeing to. He photographed every image in the box twice, once straight on and once at a slight angle that caught the surface texture of the original prints, then created a systematic catalog in his notebook that cross-referenced each photograph with the specific information it provided about the 3 destroyed components, what was visible in each image, what could be inferred from what was visible, and what remained uncertain regardless of how carefully he looked. The uncertain column was the longest of the 3, and he spent considerable time with it, not because the length of it discouraged him, but because the shape of what he did not know was as important as the shape of what he did. The specific geometry of ignorance being the thing you had to map accurately before you could make a plan for filling it. He brought the archive back to Cedar Street that afternoon and spent the rest of the weekend at the workbench in his workshop, not making anything yet, simply looking at the photographs on his laptop screen, moving between them in different sequences, building and revising his understanding of what Ray Dillon had been trying to solve with each component and how he had solved it. The 3 components were related to each other in ways that became clearer the longer he looked, each one addressing a specific aspect of the same underlying problem in the original design. And understanding this relationship was more important than understanding any individual component in isolation, because it meant that the choices Ray had made in designing each one were not arbitrary, but were responses to constraints established by the others, and that getting one wrong would likely make the others wrong too, regardless of how well they were individually made. By Sunday evening, he had a working theory about the first component, the simplest of the three, a custom bracket assembly that had addressed a vibration issue in the primary drive at high RPM. The theory was provisional, and he marked it as such in his notebook. But it was specific enough to begin working from, and on Monday evening after school, which he had technically graduated from 6 months earlier, but still occasionally referenced as a temporal marker because the habit was slow to leave, he made the first attempt. It was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, not wrong in a way that wasted the material or required starting completely over, but wrong in a way that confirmed one of the uncertainties he had identified in the catalog, that the photographs did not show the exact thickness of the material Ray had used, and that his estimate had been slightly off, producing a component that looked correct and would likely have functioned adequately in a different context, but that was not right in the sense that Ray would have understood right, which Marcus had decided was the only relevant standard. He set the first attempt on the shelf above the workbench, labeled with the date and the specific nature of the error, because failed attempts were information, and information was the only currency that actually mattered in this kind of work. And he started again with the corrected thickness and got considerably closer on the second attempt, close enough that by the third attempt on Thursday evening, the first component was something he believed would have satisfied the man in the photographs. Not because he could prove this, but because he had spent enough time now studying how Ray thought about problems to have developed a working model of his standards, and the component met those standards as Marcus understood them. He brought it to Hank's garage the following Saturday and set it on the workbench beside the relevant photographs without saying anything about it, and Hank picked it up and turned it over in his hands and looked at it, and looked at the photographs, and looked at it again, and pressed his 2 fingers to his collarbone and held them there for a moment before setting the component down and telling Marcus that he could not say for certain whether it was right, because the only person who could say for certain was not available to ask, but that it looked right to him, which was the honest version of what he could offer, and Marcus accepted it as such. Danny Reeves arrived that same Saturday morning, having called ahead to tell Hank he wanted to check in on how things were progressing, and found Marcus at the workbench with the first completed component and his notebook open to the pages dedicated to the second component, which was considerably more complex than the first, and which Marcus had been studying for several days without yet beginning to make anything from it. Danny looked at Marcus, and then at the component on the workbench, and then at Hank standing near the door, and asked who Marcus was. And Hank told him. And Danny looked at Marcus again with the specific assessing quality of an experienced professional encountering something outside his expectations. He picked up the first completed component and examined it the way he had examined the destroyed original 2 weeks earlier, turning it in his hands, looking at the specific decisions in the fabrication, the material choice and the forming technique and the finish, and set it back down on the workbench without saying anything directly to Marcus, which Marcus understood as neither endorsement nor dismissal, but as the specific response of a careful man who was not going to say anything about a piece of work until he had finished deciding what he thought about it. Danny asked Hank in a voice pitched low enough that Marcus could hear it, but that was not directed at Marcus, how old the boy was, and Hank told him 18, and Danny looked at the component again, and then at the photographs, and then at Marcus, who had returned to his notebook and was writing something with the focused, unself-conscious attention of someone for whom the presence of observers did not change what needed doing. And Danny told Hank he would come back in a few weeks and see how it was going, and Hank told him the door was open, and Danny left. Marcus did not ask what Danny had said or what Hank thought about it, because the question of what people thought about what he was doing was less interesting to him than the work itself, and the work at this point was demanding everything he had available for thinking about it, which was the other reason he had not asked to be paid, that the kind of thinking the job required was the kind of thinking that could not be divided. He spent the following 2 weeks on the second component, a custom fabricated mounting system for the modified primary cover that had to accommodate specific clearances Ray had created in the engine casing itself, which meant that the component's dimensions were constrained by the geometry of the engine in ways that the photographs showed partially and implied the rest of, and which required Marcus to develop a working model of the engine's internal geometry from the external evidence available, and then design the component to fit that model, rather than designing it in isolation and hoping it would fit. He made 4 attempts across those 2 weeks, and the 4th was correct. Correct in the right sense, rather than simply the adequate sense. And he brought it to Hank's garage and set it beside the first completed component and the relevant photographs. And Hank looked at them together for a long time before telling Marcus that his father had spent 11 days on that particular component and had rebuilt it once from scratch before he was satisfied. And Marcus received this information the way he received all information related to Ray Dillon, as data that told him something useful about the standard he was working toward. The 3rd component was the one that stopped him. Not in a dramatic way, not with a single failed attempt that revealed the problem clearly and pointed toward a solution. It stopped him the way certain problems stop certain people, gradually, and then completely, through a series of attempts that each got closer to something, and then revealed, in the getting closer, a further dimension of the problem that the previous attempts had not yet reached. By the end of the 3rd week of working on it, Marcus had 4 failed attempts on the shelf above the workbench and a notebook page covered in annotations that had become, as the weeks progressed, less a record of what he knew and more a map of the specific shape of what he did not. The component was the primary drive cover, the one Ray had designed with internal geometry that was specific to the problem he had identified in this particular engine's power delivery at sustained high load. And the external photographs showed its outer form clearly enough that Marcus had no uncertainty about what it needed to look like from the outside. The problem was the inside. The internal geometry was what made the component functional rather than merely decorative, and the photographs, for all their detail and number, showed the outside of a thing that worked by virtue of what was inside it, and no amount of studying the outside gave Marcus what he needed to be confident about the inside. He knew the function the component was designed to perform. He had reasoned carefully from that function toward a set of possible internal geometries and had made 4 attempts from the most likely of those possibilities, and each attempt had confirmed something and failed at something else, moving him closer in a way that paradoxically made the remaining distance feel further rather than nearer, the way the last portion of a difficult problem sometimes reveals its own complexity only when everything surrounding it has been resolved. He sat at his workbench on a Thursday evening in the 5th week after his first visit to Hank's garage and looked at the 4 failed attempts and his notebook and the photographs on his laptop screen. And he understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has been working on something long enough to see it honestly, that the external evidence available to him was not going to be sufficient to get him the rest of the way without additional information about how Ray had thought about this specific problem. Information that existed only in the memory of people who had known Ray Dillon and paid attention. He called Hank the following morning and asked if he could come by on Saturday, not to work in the garage, but to talk. And Hank told him yes. And on Saturday, Marcus arrived at 9 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table with Hank and Sandra and a cup of coffee he had been given without asking, and told them plainly where he was, what he understood and what he did not, and specifically what kind of information about Ray's thinking might help him get the rest of the way. Hank listened to this with the full attention he gave to everything Marcus said, which was different from the attentive courtesy he had given the doctors and the professional builders. Less polite and more genuinely interested. The attention of someone who had been watching a process unfold and had developed a real investment in its outcome. He thought about the question for a long time after Marcus finished, pressing his 2 fingers to his collarbone, his eyes on the kitchen table. And then he began to talk about his father in a way he had not talked about him in the garage. with a different kind of detail, and from a different kind of place. Less the facts of what Ray had made, and more the facts of how Ray had thought. He told Marcus that his father had a specific belief about the relationship between simplicity and elegance, that the right solution to any mechanical problem was always the simplest one that addressed all of the problem's requirements simultaneously, and that this belief had sometimes led him to spend considerable time arriving at solutions that looked obvious once they existed, but that required real thinking to find, because simple and obvious were different qualities, and the difference between them was usually the distance between an adequate solution and a right one. He told Marcus that his father had been particularly suspicious of solutions that required additional components or additional complexity to work, that when Ray found himself adding something to make something else work, he took it as a signal that he had not yet found the actual solution and needed to keep thinking. He told Marcus about a conversation he remembered from when he was about 15, standing in the workshop while Ray was working on the primary drive cover. And Ray had stopped what he was doing and told him, unprompted, that the engine was telling him something he was not quite hearing yet, that there was a conversation happening between the primary drive and the casing at high load that nobody had bothered to listen to because the standard solution handled it adequately. And adequate was, in Ray's view, the enemy of understanding. He had stood at the workbench for several minutes after saying this, doing nothing, just thinking, and then had gone back to work and not spoken again for the rest of the afternoon. Sandra added something while Hank paused to refill his coffee, quietly and from a slightly different angle, telling Marcus that Ray had always said the most important thing about any custom component was that it needed to understand where it lived, meaning that a component designed in isolation from the system it was part of never performed as well as one designed with the system in mind from the beginning, and that this was why Ray had always built the component and tested it in the actual engine before considering it finished, adjusting the geometry based on what the engine told him rather than what his calculations predicted. Marcus listened to all of this without writing anything down, which was unusual for him and which Hank noticed, understanding it to mean that Marcus was receiving information at a depth that note-taking would have interrupted. And when Marcus eventually thanked them and left, Hank sat at the kitchen table for a while after with his coffee and felt something that he had not felt since the accident. A quality of forward motion in the situation, the sense that something was happening that was pointed somewhere specific, even if the destination was not yet fully visible. Marcus drove back to Cedar Street and went directly to his workshop and sat at the workbench and looked at the 4 failed attempts and his notebook and thought about everything Hank had told him, specifically about the idea of the engine as a conversation and about the principle of simplicity as a signal of correctness and about the component needing to understand where it lived. He sat with these ideas for 2 hours without touching anything, which was unusual for him in the way that it had been unusual for him to put his notebook away at Hank's kitchen table. Both instances of the same thing, information that needed to be received at a particular depth before it could be used. Then he opened his notebook to a clean page and began drawing, not the component itself, but the relationship between the component and the engine. The conversation Ray had described, the specific dynamic that the component existed to address, drawing it as a system rather than as a set of parts. And somewhere across the following hour of drawing and erasing and drawing again, the shape of the internal geometry became clear to him, not through calculation, but through understanding. The way a word you have been trying to remember sometimes arrives not when you are actively reaching for it, but when you have finally stopped insisting on finding it and let the arriving happen. He picked up the material and began the 5th attempt. The 5th attempt took 11 days. Not 11 days of continuous work. The Cedar Street workshop was an evening and weekend operation by practical necessity. Marcus still taking the small jobs that the neighborhood brought him and helping his mother with the things around the house that needed helping with. But 11 days in which the fifth attempt was the thing his mind returned to in the spaces between other things. The way a difficult problem occupies a person not just when they are working on it, but when they are doing everything else. Running a background process that surfaces occasionally with something worth writing down, or sometimes only with the sense that something is moving in the right direction without yet being able to say exactly what. He worked on it in the evenings from 7 until the light and his concentration gave out, usually around 11, and on Saturday mornings from 6 when the neighborhood was quiet, and the specific quality of early morning light through the workshop window was the kind of light that made detailed work easier rather than harder. A flat, even light, without the shadows that complicated the reading of fine surfaces. His mother brought him coffee at 8 on those mornings, appearing at the workshop door without knocking, setting the cup on the corner of the bench away from the work, and going back inside without requiring conversation, which Marcus understood as one of the more considered forms of support available to a person. The internal geometry that had come to him through the drawing 2 hours after he left Hank's kitchen was different from any of his previous 4 attempts in a specific and fundamental way. The previous attempts had all addressed the problem from the outside in, starting with the external constraints visible in the photographs and reasoning inward toward what the interior must look like to satisfy them. The fifth attempt reversed this, starting with the conversation Hank had described Ray identifying between the primary drive and the casing at high load, modeling that conversation as a dynamic system, and designing the internal geometry to participate in that system rather than simply to contain it, which was the difference Hank had been trying to describe without quite having the mechanical language for it when he talked about Ray's belief that the component needed to understand where it lived. The fabrication itself was the most demanding work Marcus had ever done. Not in terms of the individual operations required, each of which was within his capability, but in terms of the sustained precision required across the full sequence of operations, because each step constrained the next in ways that allowed for almost no correction once a decision was made, which meant that the decisions had to be right before he made them, rather than approximately right and adjusted afterward. And the confidence to make each decision correctly required a level of understanding of the whole system that Marcus had to maintain continuously across 11 days of work, not letting it slip between sessions or get diluted by the other demands on his attention. He made 2 mistakes across those 11 days, both of them caught before they became permanent errors, both of them instructive in specific ways that refined his understanding of what he was making and why. And on the evening of the 11th day, a Friday, he held the completed 5th attempt under the workshop light and looked at it for a long time. It was not perfect in the cosmetic sense. There were marks on the surface that a professional shop with proper finishing equipment would have been able to remove, and which Marcus had removed as well as his available tools allowed, but which remained faintly present to anyone looking closely. This did not concern him because Ray's original components had not been perfect in the cosmetic sense either, the photographs showing the specific surface character of handwork done by someone whose standard was function over appearance, and Marcus's component matched this character in a way that felt accurate rather than accidental. What concerned him more was the interior, which he could assess through the function of the moving parts he had built into it, but could not directly see once the component was assembled, and which he had to trust based on his understanding of the system and the reasoning that had produced the design. He ran the moving parts through their range of motion several times, feeling for the specific quality of movement that indicated correct internal geometry, rather than merely adequate internal geometry. And on the 3rd pass, he felt something that he recognized as the right thing. A smoothness and consistency of operation that was different in a specific and unmistakable way from the 4 previous attempts, each of which had been smoother and more consistent than the last, but none of which had had quite this quality. He put the component down on the bench and sat on his stool for a while. He did not feel triumphant, which had never been a feeling he found particularly useful, but he felt something. The specific, quiet satisfaction of a difficult problem correctly resolved, and he allowed himself to sit with it for a few minutes before he picked up his notebook and made the entry for the evening. Date, attempt number, assessment, and one additional note that he did not usually make, that this one felt like it was built to the right standard, marking the qualification because he was 18 years old and had never met Ray Dillon, and could not know for certain whether his sense of Ray's standards was accurate or a construction of his own making. He brought the component to Hank's garage on Saturday morning and set it on the workbench beside the first two completed components and the relevant photographs. And then he did something he had not done with either of the previous two deliveries. He stepped back from the workbench and waited, giving Hank the space to approach the component on his own terms, rather than at a pace determined by Marcus's presence beside it. Hank picked it up with his good hand, the collarbone still healing, and looked at it for a long time. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the component again. He turned it over and looked at the underside and the interior openings and ran his thumb along one of the internal surfaces, a slow, deliberate motion. And then he set it down and stood with his hand resting flat on the workbench beside it, not touching it, but close to it. And Marcus watched his two fingers move toward his collarbone and stop partway there. The gesture interrupted, which was a different version of the gesture, and Marcus filed the difference away as information. Sandra appeared in the garage doorway with the photograph box in her hands, having apparently decided this was the right moment for something she had been considering, and she brought the box to the workbench and opened it, and took from the top of the stack the photograph of Ray standing beside the motorcycle on the day it first ran, the one Hank had described to her as the only time he ever saw his father look completely satisfied. She set it on the workbench beside the three completed components, and the three of them looked at the arrangement on the bench, the photograph and the components and the evidence they represented, and nobody said anything for a while. Then Sandra told Marcus, in the quiet, direct voice she used when she was saying something she had thought about carefully, that she would like him to keep the photograph at his workbench in the Cedar Street workshop for the remaining work, not because she thought he needed it for technical reasons, but because she thought Ray would have wanted it there. That a man who had spent 4 years making something by hand would have understood what Marcus was doing and would have wanted his presence known in the space where the finishing work was happening. Marcus looked at the photograph and then at Sandra and told her he would take good care of it, and she told him she knew he would. And Marcus took the photograph home that afternoon and propped it against the lamp on his workbench where the light would reach it while he worked. Danny Reeves came back to Hank's garage on a Saturday morning in the first week of December, 3 weeks after Marcus had delivered the third completed component, arriving unannounced the way he had arrived the first time, pulling up outside without calling ahead, because Danny operated on the understanding that the right time to see something was when you decided to go see it, rather than when it had been arranged for you to see it. And arrangements had a way of changing what you saw by preparing both the thing and yourself for the seeing of it. Marcus was not there that morning. He had begun coming to the garage twice a week as the reassembly phase approached, spending Saturday mornings working through the technical assessment of what the reassembly would require, what order the components needed to go back in, what additional work the frame and engine repairs would need before the 3 new components could be installed. But this particular Saturday, he had a job on Cedar Street that could not be moved, a replacement shaft for a piece of equipment that someone needed by Monday and that Marcus had promised would be ready. He had told Hank he would come in the afternoon if there was time, and Hank had told him there was no rush. Danny found Hank in the garage, standing beside the workbench where the 3 completed components were laid out beside the relevant photographs, which had been their resting place since Marcus had delivered the third one, Hank having arranged them this way without quite deciding to, the components and the photographs simply falling into a natural relationship with each other that felt right to leave undisturbed. Danny looked at the arrangement on the workbench from the garage doorway before he came in, taking in the whole picture before approaching any part of it, which was how he looked at everything mechanical, and perhaps everything else as well. He came to the bench and picked up the first component, the bracket assembly, and examined it the way he had examined it 3 weeks earlier on his previous visit, turning it in his hands, looking at the specific fabrication decisions, the material and the forming technique and the tolerances. He set it down and picked up the second component, the mounting system, and gave it the same examination, slower this time, spending more time with the specific areas where the geometry was most demanding. He set that one down and picked up the primary drive cover and turned it over in his hands, and looked at the exterior, and then looked at the interior openings, and ran his own thumb along one of the internal surfaces in the same slow, deliberate motion Hank had used 3 weeks earlier. He set it down on the bench and stood there with his hands at his sides, looking at all 3 of them for a while. And then he picked up the photograph of Ray Dillon standing beside the finished motorcycle, the one Sandra had brought down from the closet and that Hank had placed at the end of the workbench after Marcus had returned it from Cedar Street the previous Saturday when the third component was complete. Danny held the photograph and looked at it for a moment, and then set it back down and looked at Hank. He asked Hank how old Marcus was, and Hank told him 18, the same answer he had given on Danny's first visit. And Danny nodded slowly, in the way of someone acknowledging a fact rather than receiving new information, having already known the answer and asked the question anyway, because certain facts bear repeating when the context around them has changed significantly enough to change their meaning. He asked where Marcus had trained, and Hank told him about the Cedar Street workshop, the tools Marcus had built and assembled himself, the library books and the online resources, and the 5 years of work that had preceded anything visible to anyone outside the neighborhood. Danny listened to all of this, looking at the 3 components on the bench, and when Hank finished, Danny was quiet for a long time. Then he said, quietly enough that Hank had to pay attention to hear it clearly, that the third component was correct. Not adequate, not close, not a reasonable approximation given the circumstances. Correct. He said it with the specific precision of a professional making a technical assessment rather than offering comfort, because Danny Reeves did not offer comfort through imprecision, and Hank had known him long enough to understand that the statement meant exactly what it said, and nothing more and nothing less. He said he had been wrong when he told Hank the components could not be replicated by anyone currently alive with access to what was actually needed, and that he had been wrong in a specific way, which was that he had defined access to what was needed as access to skill and equipment and documentation, and that it had not occurred to him that access to what was needed could also mean access to time and patience, and a quality of thinking about problems that was not the same as expertise, but was, in this specific case, more useful than expertise had been. He said this directly and without the hedging that would have softened the admission, and Hank received it with the same straightforward attention with which he received most difficult things, not making more of it than it was, but not making less of it either. Because Danny Reeves was not a man who said he was wrong lightly or often, and the saying of it deserved to land where it landed. Hank told Danny that he had something to pass along to Marcus, whatever he wanted to say, and Danny shook his head and told him it was not the kind of thing that passed along well through a third party, that he would say it to Marcus directly when the time was right. And the time was not yet right, because the work was not yet finished. And what he wanted to say was specifically about the finished thing rather than the work in progress. Hank told him he understood, and Danny nodded, and told him he would come back when the reassembly was complete. And Hank said he was welcome any time, and Danny left. Hank stood in the garage after he heard Danny's truck pull away, and looked at the 3 components and the photograph on the workbench, and pressed his 2 fingers to his collarbone and held them there. The collarbone was healing at the pace the doctor had described, which was slower than Hank would have chosen, but faster than his patience suggested. And the specific ache of it had become, across the weeks since the accident, something he was aware of in the background of most moments, the way you are aware of weather before it arrives. He was aware of it now, and he held his fingers there for a moment, and then took his hand down and looked at the photograph of his father standing beside the finished motorcycle, and thought about the fact that a boy he had not known 2 months ago had spent those 2 months learning to think the way his father thought, not through any instruction or documentation, but through the specific, sustained attention that the work itself had demanded, and that the result of that thinking was lying on the workbench beside the photograph, looking more like what it was supposed to look like than Hank had believed anything ever would again. When Marcus arrived that afternoon, he found Hank at the workbench with a piece of paper and a pencil, working through the reassembly sequence by hand, sketching the order of operations in the simple, direct way of someone who thought better with a pencil than without one. Marcus set down his jacket and came to the bench and looked at what Hank had sketched, and told him the sequence was right except for one step: the frame repair needing to be assessed and confirmed before the engine went back in rather than after, because the frame geometry affected the engine mounting tolerances, and doing it in the wrong order would potentially require undoing work they had already done. And Hank looked at his sketch and crossed out the step and moved it to its correct position and said that was right, and they stood at the bench together and went through the rest of the sequence: the father's motorcycle, and the photograph of the father and the 2 men who were going to put it back together, filling the garage with a specific kind of purposeful quiet that was different from the quiet of the weeks before, pointed now, moving towards something rather than simply sitting with something. And both of them understood the difference, and neither of them needed to say so. The reassembly began on the 2nd Saturday of December and proceeded across 3 weeks in the careful, methodical sequence that Marcus and Hank had mapped out at the workbench the previous month, each step confirming the one before it the way well-planned work confirms itself, the components fitting where they were designed to fit and the tolerances holding where they had been calculated to hold, producing a cumulative confidence in the process that neither of them had felt entitled to at the start, but that arrived naturally as each completed step removed one more category of uncertainty from what remained. The frame repair had been done by a specialist Hank knew, a man named Joe, who had been straightening frames for 20 years, and who had come to the garage 2 weeks before the reassembly began, examined the bent rails with the unhurried professional attention of someone who had seen most things twice, and told Hank the frame could be brought back to within tolerances that would allow the original geometry to be restored. He had done the work over 2 days, the first day heating and straightening, and the second day measuring and adjusting and measuring again. And when he left, the frame rails were as close to their original positions as the metal's memory of the accident would allow, which was close enough that Marcus, measuring the key tolerances for the engine mounting the following Saturday, had found all of them within the range that mattered. Marcus worked on the engine casing crack during the same 2 weeks, a process that required welding from the outside and reinforcing from the inside in a sequence that had to be done in a specific order to avoid introducing new stress concentrations near the repair, and that he had researched carefully before beginning, reading everything he could find about crack repair in cast engine casings, and talking it through with Hank and with a machinist on the other side of town named Gerald, who had never met Marcus before, but who spent 40 minutes on the phone with him one evening because Marcus had asked the right questions, and Gerald was a man who responded well to right questions. The repair held. When Marcus pressure tested the repaired section on the Friday before the reassembly began, using a method he had developed from reading and adapted to what his workshop's equipment would support, it held at pressure higher than the engine would ever produce in normal operation, and he recorded the test result in his notebook with the same matter-of-fact precision he gave to everything else, and came to the garage the following morning ready to begin. Hank helped where his collarbone allowed, which was more than the doctor would have sanctioned and less than Hank wanted, a compromise they arrived at through the specific negotiation of two people working closely enough together that the limits of one become visible to the other without needing to be declared. Marcus handed him things, and Hank held things, and occasionally Marcus asked him a question about the original build that only Hank could answer. Where had this fastener come from? What direction had his father run this line? Was there something specific about this junction that Hank remembered his father paying particular attention to? And Hank answered these questions from 30 years of memory with a reliability that Marcus had come to depend on. The answers always specific and always consistent with everything else Hank had told him. The memory of a man for whom this particular motorcycle had been a primary object of attention for most of his adult life. Sandra came into the garage on the Thursday evening of the second week of reassembly and stopped in the doorway the way people stop when they encounter something that requires a moment of adjustment before proceeding further. The motorcycle was taking its shape back. Not fully, not yet. The 3 new components not yet installed, and the cosmetic surfaces not yet addressed. But the fundamental structure of it was present in a way it had not been since the accident. The engine back in the frame, the primary drive reassembled, the overall silhouette of the thing emerging from what had been for 2 months simply a damaged accumulation of parts. She stood in the doorway and looked at it and said nothing for a long moment, and then told Marcus, without looking at him, but in a voice directed at him, that it looked like itself. And Marcus, who was calibrating a measurement on the primary drive housing, said that it should look more like itself by the end of the week. And Sandra nodded and went back inside. The chapter came on the Saturday at the end of the second week, 7 members arriving in the late morning after Hank had mentioned to the group that the reassembly was proceeding, not as a formal invitation, but as the kind of passing information that resulted. In a chapter that had been following this situation with quiet collective attention across the past 2 months, in people showing up because the moment seemed worth being present for. They stood around the motorcycle with the coffee Sandra had made and talked in the low, murmuring way of people who are in the presence of something that warrants consideration rather than noise. And Marcus worked among them without adjusting his pace or his focus, treating the presence of 6 large men in leather vests in the garage as neither an audience nor an imposition, but simply as the current condition of the space. Danny Reeves was not among them that morning. He had told Hank he would come when the reassembly was complete, and he kept to that, which Hank understood as its own kind of respect for the process, Danny not wanting to see the work until it was the work, rather than the work in progress. The 3 new components went in during the final week of December, across 4 evenings that Hank attended entirely, sitting on the wooden stool and saying little, his 2 fingers occasionally moving to his collarbone and resting there for a moment before coming down. Marcus installed each component with the care he had given to making them, fitting them to the engine and the frame and to each other with the precise, deliberate attention of someone who understood that installation was itself a form of argument about what the thing was, that how you put something together expressed what you believed it was for. The primary drive cover went in last, on the 4th evening, and when it was seated and secured, Marcus ran his hands over the exterior one final time, not checking anything technical, simply looking at it. The surface of the component he had spent 11 days making, sitting in the engine where Ray Dillon had put the original in 1984. Fitting the space as if it had always been there, which in every sense that mattered, it had. The geometry right, and the material right, and the function right, in the specific meaning of right that Hank had described from his father's vocabulary, and that Marcus had been working toward across 3 months without knowing for certain until this moment that he had found it. He stepped back from the motorcycle, and Hank stood up from the stool, and they both looked at it. The reassembly was complete. The motorcycle was not yet started, the first start being a separate and significant event that deserved its own preparation and its own moment. But it was whole again. Whole in a way that had not been guaranteed 2 months ago when Marcus had stood in this garage for the first time and told Hank he believed he could do it. And neither of them said anything for a long time. The garage quiet around them, and the December evening settling outside, and the motorcycle standing in the center of the space, looking exactly like what it was. The first start was set for a Saturday morning in January, 3 weeks after the reassembly was complete. Not because anything technical required the delay, but because Hank had asked for the time, needing to let the completed motorcycle sit in the garage and be real before he introduced the further reality of it running, the way certain truths need to be lived alongside for a while before they can be fully received. Marcus had understood this without it being explained, and had spent those 3 weeks on Cedar Street completing other work and occasionally going back through his notebook from the beginning, reading the entries from the first examination of the photographs through the 11 days of the 5th attempt at the primary drive cover, understanding the record as a document that had meaning beyond the work itself. He had also spent part of that time doing something he had not told Hank or Sandra about, which was making a small additional component, not one of the 3 destroyed originals, but something new. A bracket mounting for the photograph of Ray Dillon standing beside the motorcycle on its first running day, made from the same material and with the same surface character as the 3 fabricated components, sized to hold the photograph at the eye level of someone standing beside the workbench lamp where Marcus had kept it across the 3 months of fabrication. He had made it carefully and without drama, the same way he made everything, and he brought it to the garage the Friday evening before the first start, when Hank was inside and the garage was empty, and mounted it to the workbench post with 2 screws, and set the photograph in it, and stepped back and looked at it under the lamp, and decided it was right, in the sense that mattered, and went home. Hank found it Saturday morning when he came out to the garage before anyone else arrived, and stood looking at it for a long time in the early quiet of a January morning, the photograph of his father in its new frame on the workbench post, and the motorcycle behind it, both of them in the same space at the same time. And he pressed 2 fingers to his collarbone and held them there, and looked at his father's face in the photograph, the expression that Hank had described as the only time he ever saw his father look completely satisfied. And something in his chest moved in a way he did not try to name or contain. The chapter arrived at 9, 7 members, the same 7 who had come during the reassembly, plus 2 others who had heard through the informal channels that something significant was happening, and who had decided, independently and correctly, that this was not a morning to be elsewhere. Danny Reeves arrived at 9:15, alone, parking on the street rather than the driveway, walking up to the garage with his hands in his jacket pockets and nodding to the chapter members gathered near the garage door without stopping to talk. He came inside and looked at the motorcycle for a long time, the way he had looked at the 3 components on the workbench 3 weeks earlier. The full and deliberate attention of a professional taking something in properly before saying anything about it. Sandra stood at the garage door with her coffee, close enough to be present and far enough to give the space to the people who needed it, which was the specific positioning she had maintained across everything that had happened in this garage over the past 3 months, present and unobtrusive. The person who had made the whole thing possible by paying attention to a conversation at church and acting on it. Marcus stood slightly apart from the chapter near the workbench, his jacket on, his hands in his pockets, the same posture he had brought to Hank's garage on his very first visit, looking at the motorcycle with the same quality of attention he brought to everything he had worked on. Not the attention of someone waiting for something, but the attention of someone watching to see if the thing they made is what they intended it to be. Hank came out of the house at 9:20 and stood at the garage door for a moment before coming in, which nobody commented on, everyone present understanding that the moment warranted whatever preparation it required. He was wearing the jacket he wore for long rides, a worn leather thing that smelled of the road in the specific way of jackets that have earned that quality rather than simply aged into it. And he looked at the motorcycle and at the photograph on the workbench and at the people gathered in his garage and said good morning in a voice that was controlled and ordinary and that told everyone exactly what it was costing him to keep it that way. He came to the motorcycle and stood beside it for a moment with his hand on the tank, the same position as the man in the photograph, and nobody moved or spoke, and the garage was quiet with the specific quality of quiet that belongs to a room full of people who are all paying full attention to the same thing at the same time. Then Hank swung his leg over the seat, his collarbone complaining in the familiar way it complained when he asked too much of it, and settled into the machine beneath him and put his hands on the grips and felt the weight of it under him, the specific weight he had known for 30 years, and sat there for a moment with his eyes closed. He opened them and reached for the ignition, and the garage held its breath. He pressed the starter. The engine turned over once and stopped. The specific, flat silence of an engine that has not yet decided to run filled the garage for 1 second that felt considerably longer. And Marcus, watching from near the workbench, looked at nothing in particular with his eyes focused slightly inward in the way he focused when he was running through a sequence in his mind. And then he was still. The engine turned over a second time and caught. It did not start gradually. It started the way engines that are correctly built start, immediately and completely, the combustion sequence finding its rhythm within the first revolution and settling into it with the confidence of a mechanism doing what it was designed to do without any uncertainty about whether it was going to manage it or not. The idol settled and held, not hunting, not stumbling, simply present. And the sound that filled the garage was not just the sound of an engine running, but the specific sound of this engine, with its particular exhaust note shaped by 30 years of use, and Ray Dillon's specific choices about displacement and tuning, and the 3 components that Marcus had spent 3 months making to Ray's internal standard without ever having met the man. Sandra said from the garage door, in a voice that carried more than she perhaps intended it to carry, "That is the sound. That is exactly the sound it made when Ray wrote it." And the garage went quiet with the engine running through the quiet, the sound filling the space the way water fills a vessel, and nobody said anything for a long time. Danny Reeves was standing 3 feet from Marcus when the engine caught, and he watched Marcus's face in the moment the engine found its rhythm, and what he saw there was not triumph and was not relief, but was the specific expression of someone watching a correct answer prove itself in the physical world, the quiet completion of a person who has been working towards something for long enough that the arriving at it is less an explosion than a settling, the way the last piece of a long problem slides into place without announcement. Danny came to stand beside Marcus, and the 2 of them stood together watching Hank sit on the running motorcycle with his hands on the grips and his head tilted slightly forward and his eyes on something that was not in the garage. And Danny said quietly to Marcus, directly and without the qualification he had used 3 weeks earlier when he told Hank the 3rd component was correct, that he had been doing this work for 25 years and had never seen anything like what Marcus had done across the past 3 months, and that he wanted Marcus to hear that from him directly. Marcus looked at him and said nothing for a moment, receiving the statement with the same lack of performance he brought to everything. And then he told Danny that the work had been harder than anything he had ever done, and that he understood considerably more about what was possible now than he had 3 months ago. And Danny looked at him and said that was the point of hard work, that it changed the boundary of what was possible, rather than simply completing what was already known to be possible. And Marcus nodded once, the specific nod of someone who has heard something true and is marking it as such. Hank sat on the running motorcycle for 6 minutes and then switched the engine off and sat in the silence that followed for another long moment before swinging his leg over and standing beside the machine with his hand on the tank and his 2 fingers against his collarbone and his eyes on the photograph of his father at the workbench and the photograph of his father looking back at him from across 30 years and across everything that had happened in this garage. And whatever passed between the man and the photograph in that moment belonged entirely to them. January settled over Millbrook the way January always settled there, cold and clear and without apology. The kind of month that stripped everything down to its actual weight rather than its appearance. The motorcycle had been running for 3 weeks, Hank taking it out on the clear mornings when the roads were dry and the cold was the clean kind rather than the damp kind that worked into old injuries. Short rides at first, 20 minutes down Route 9 and back, extending gradually as the collarbone continued its slow, reliable healing, and as Hank and the motorcycle resumed the specific conversation between a rider and a machine that had been interrupted by the October accident and was now, carefully and incrementally, being resumed. Sandra watched him leave on these mornings from the kitchen window, the same window from which she had watched him sit in the dark garage on those early evenings after the accident. And the difference between what she saw now and what she had seen then was not dramatic, was not the kind of difference that announced itself, but was real and specific and permanent in the way that the most important differences always were, quiet and structural, belonging to the foundation rather than the surface. Danny Reeves called Marcus on the second Saturday in January, the call coming at 8 in the morning, which Marcus understood as a sign that Danny had been thinking about making it for a while and had not wanted to delay it further. He told Marcus he had a workshop in Sacramento that he had been running for 22 years, and that he had been looking for someone to bring in for 2 years and had not found the right person, and that he was calling because he had now found the right person and wanted to know if Marcus was interested in talking about it. Marcus told him he was interested in talking about it. Danny told him to come down the following weekend, and they would spend 2 days in the shop and see how the conversation went, and Marcus said he would be there, and the call ended, and Marcus sat at his workbench on Cedar Street, with the phone in his hand, and looked at the empty bracket on the workbench post where the photograph of Ray Dillon had been before he returned it to Sandra the previous week, and felt the specific forward motion of a life-changing direction. He told his mother that evening, and she sat with it for a moment in the way she sat with important things, and then told him it was the right thing, and that she had known for 3 years that Cedar Street was the right place for the work he had been doing, and was not the final place, and that Danny Reeves's shop was neither of those things, but was the next thing, and that next things were how the right final things were eventually reached. Marcus looked at her and told her he knew that, and she told him she knew he knew it, and they had dinner, and the evening was ordinary, and the ordinary of it felt exactly right. Coach Ellen Marsh called Hank on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of January, having heard about the motorcycle through her own channels, the specific, informal network of a small town carrying a story that deserved to be carried, and asked Hank if he would be willing to let her bring 6 students from the high school to the garage, not to look at the finished motorcycle, but to look at Marcus's notebook, which she had heard about, and which she believed contained the most honest and complete record of how a difficult problem was actually solved that she had encountered in 11 years of teaching students how to work with their hands. Hank told her to ask Marcus. Marcus said yes. The 6 students came on a Thursday afternoon and sat at the workbench with the notebook, and Marcus talked them through it from the first entry to the last, not performing the explanation, but simply giving it the way he gave everything, directly and without simplification, and Ellen Marsh stood at the back of the garage and watched her students read the record of 11 days of failed and corrected attempts at a single component and understood, watching their faces, that they were receiving something that no formal curriculum she had ever taught had been able to deliver in quite this form, which was the honest and unedited record of what thinking through a hard problem actually looked like from the inside. Sandra had the photograph of Ray Dillon framed properly in February, a simple wooden frame that matched the character of the photograph rather than announcing itself, and she hung it in the hallway of the house where the light from the window caught it in the afternoon, and Hank passed it every day going in and out, and occasionally stopped and looked at it the way you look at someone you have been thinking about, acknowledging the looking rather than passing it off as something else. On the last Saturday of January, Hank rode the motorcycle to the chapter garage on Randolph Street for the first time since the accident, arriving in the mid-morning to find several members already there, and he parked outside and came in, and the members who were there acknowledged his arrival in the specific way the chapter acknowledged significant arrivals, without ceremony but with complete attention. And someone made coffee, and they stood around talking in the ordinary way of people who share a history and a language and a particular understanding of why mornings like this one mattered, even when nothing dramatic was happening in them. Marcus was not there that morning. He was on Cedar Street, finishing the last small job that had been waiting while the motorcycle work consumed his attention. A replacement bracket for a neighbor whose gate had been broken since October, and he finished it and cleaned up the workshop and stood in the doorway looking at the space, the lathe and the welder and the drill press and the workbench with the empty bracket on the post. And he felt something that he had been carrying without fully naming for 3 months settle into its final form, the understanding of what the past 3 months had actually been, which was not the completion of a job, but the discovery of a capacity he had not previously known he possessed, the ability to reason his way into the mind of another maker through the physical evidence they left behind, to understand a person through the logic of what they made well enough to continue what they started. He locked the workshop and went inside and told his mother he was going to Hank's garage to return the wrench set he had borrowed in November, and his mother told him to stay for dinner if Sandra offered, and he said he would see. The motorcycle was in the driveway when he arrived, Hank having just come back from the morning ride, the engine still warm, the specific smell of a running engine cooling in cold air present in the driveway as Marcus came through the gate. Hank was crouching beside the left side of the engine, looking at the primary drive cover with the same deliberate attention he had given everything across the past 3 months. And he looked up when Marcus came through the gate and told him he had been listening to it, the engine, on the ride, and that it sounded the way it should sound, and that the primary drive cover was doing what it was supposed to do at every RPM range he had tested. And Marcus told him he was glad to hear that, and came to crouch beside Hank, and they both looked at the component for a moment, the surface of it catching the January light. Hank asked him what he was going to do next. Marcus told him about Danny's call and the weekend in Sacramento, and Hank listened and nodded and told him that was right, that the work on Cedar Street had been the work of learning, and the work in Sacramento would be the work of doing, and that both of those things mattered, and neither of them was the other. Marcus agreed. They stood up from beside the motorcycle, and Hank put his hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder, the good shoulder, and said nothing. And Marcus understood everything that was meant by it, and said nothing either. And the January morning continued around them, cold and clear and moving forward. Sandra appeared at the front door and told them both that coffee was on if they wanted it, and they went inside, and the motorcycle stood in the driveway in the winter light, the engine cooling, patient and complete, exactly what it had always been, and more than it had briefly stopped being, ready to be ridden again whenever the road required it. Some things, when they are rebuilt correctly, do not simply return to what they were. they become also what survived the breaking of them. And that is a different and more complete thing than what existed before. Ray Dillon built a motorcycle by hand across 4 years in a backyard workshop, making components that existed nowhere else in the world, and took the knowledge of how he made them with him when he died. An accident destroyed those components, and every professional builder who looked at the wreck said the same thing, that without the man who made them, they were gone forever. An 18-year-old with no credentials and no shop and no formal training asked to see the photographs. He spent 3 months reasoning backward through 30 years of someone else's thinking until he understood it well enough to continue it. He charged for the cost of materials. There are people like Marcus in every town, working in backyard workshops and small garages, building skill in the specific hard way that only happens when you cannot afford to do it any other way. Most of them never find a problem large enough to show the world what they have built. Marcus found one. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell us what part stayed with you the longest. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe so you're here when the next one arrives. And if you know someone building something in a backyard somewhere, quietly and without recognition, send this to them today. We will see you in the next one.